At its peak, ancient Rome gave free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens every month, enough to feed a city of nearly 1 million people without modern farms, trucks, or refrigeration. The capital of the empire, a sprawling metropolis of marble and mud, depended on a flow of food that crossed the entire Mediterranean Sea. Ships from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily sailed into the port of Ostia, their holds filled with wheat destined for the hungry mouths of Rome. This was the Annona, the grain dole, a system that distributed free or subsidized grain to registered Roman citizens for centuries. How did an ancient empire, dependent on slow ships and seasonal harvests, manage to feed its capital for free? Why did this act of generosity quietly turn into a political necessity? The answer reveals a truth about power that every ruler since has understood. Control food, and you control the people. The story begins in the late Roman Republic, a time of expanding empire and growing inequality. As Rome conquered the Mediterranean, wealth flowed into the city, but so did displaced farmers and unemployed veterans. The urban population swelled with people who had no land, no work, and no reliable source of food. In 123 BC, a populist reformer named Gaius Gracchus proposed a radical solution. The state would provide grain to Roman citizens at a subsidized price. The lex frumentaria, the grain law, was designed to win political support from the urban masses, who had become a force in Roman politics. Gracchus was killed by his opponents, but his idea survived. The grain dole had proven too powerful a tool to abandon. Over the following decades, the dole expanded. Politicians used it to secure votes. Generals used it to reward loyalty. By the time Augustus became the first emperor, the grain dole was a permanent feature of Roman life, embedded in the architecture of imperial power. Augustus formalized the system, creating a dedicated bureaucracy to manage the supply and distribution of grain. He established the Praefectus Annonae, a prefect whose sole responsibility was ensuring Rome never went hungry. Under Augustus, as many as 200,000 citizens received free grain on a monthly basis, a number that would grow in subsequent centuries. But the grain dole was not charity. It was a carefully engineered political system with multiple layers of control. The mechanism worked like this. Rome relied heavily on grain imports from its provinces, especially Egypt, which became the empire's breadbasket. Egypt alone shipped millions of modi of grain to Rome each year, a flow so vital that emperors forbade senators from even visiting the province without permission. The state taxed these provinces partly in grain instead of money, transforming tax collection into a food procurement system. Massive fleets of purpose-built grain ships crossed the Mediterranean, protected by the Roman navy from pirates and enemies. Upon arrival at Portus, the artificial harbor Augustus built near us, the grain was transferred to barges and towed up the Tiber to Rome. In the city, the grain was stored in enormous warehouses called horia, some large enough to hold the harvest of entire provinces. From these granaries, it was distributed to registered citizens at designated points throughout the city, each distribution carefully recorded. To receive grain, a citizen needed a tessera, a token proving their eligibility, linking their identity to the state's records. In exchange for this monthly ration, the urban population remained politically stable and less likely to riot. Rome's emperors understood what every modern government knows. Hungry people are dangerous people. The grain supply became a tool of control, a way to reward loyalty and punish dissent. When a province rebelled, when a shipment was delayed, when a faction threatened stability, the flow of grain could be adjusted accordingly. The dole was not just about feeding the poor, it was about feeding the empire's political stability. Over time, the number of recipients grew, and the system became a permanent obligation of the state, impossible to remove. What had begun as a political reform under the Republic became a structural necessity under the empire. Rome's survival became tied to secure grain routes stretching thousands of miles across dangerous seas. Any disruption storms, piracy, rebellion in key provinces, conflict with rival powers could trigger famine and unrest in the capital. The city that ruled the world could not feed itself without the empire it ruled. This is the historical irony at the heart of the Annona. The system that kept Rome peaceful also made it profoundly fragile. The population of Rome had been transformed from producers into dependents, from citizens into clients of the imperial state. They no longer grew their own food, no longer traded for their own sustenance. They waited for the ships to arrive, and if the ships did not arrive, they did not eat. And if they did not eat, they rioted. And if they rioted, emperors fell. This dependence created a permanent vulnerability that enemies of Rome could exploit. The Persians never sacked Rome. The Goths never captured its granaries, but the threat of disruption was always present. Every emperor knew that his reign could end not on a battlefield, but in a breadline. This is why the grain supply was guarded so fiercely, why Egypt was treated as a personal possession of the emperor. Control of grain was control of Rome, and control of Rome was control of the empire. The pattern did not end with Rome. It repeats wherever large populations concentrate and depend on distant sources of food. Today, modern cities and nations rely on global supply chains, subsidies, and food assistance programs to maintain social stability. The forms have changed, but the underlying logic remains. When a population depends on the state for survival, food becomes more than a necessity, it becomes a leva of power. Governments use food subsidies to win elections, to pacify unrest, to reward constituencies. They stockpile grain, control distribution, monarchia praesis, all in the name of stability. Unlike Rome, they create populations that are dependent on systems they do not control. When these systems fail through inflation, shortages, supply disruptions, or policy mistakes, political unrest follows quickly. The Arab Spring was triggered in part by rising food prices. Bread riots have toppled governments across history. The same dynamic that played out in the streets of ancient Rome plays out in the streets of modern capitals. People tolerate much: corruption, inequality, oppression, but they do not tolerate hunger. And those who control the food supply understand this perfectly. The grain dole was not a kindness. It was a calculation, a transaction, a system of control dressed as generosity. Rome's emperors gave bread, and in return, they received something far more valuable: the passive consent of the governed. The population traded political power for physical survival. They gave up their right to demand more in exchange for the guarantee of enough. This is the quiet architecture of the Annona, and of every food system designed to stabilize rather than empower. Free systems are rarely free. They come with obligations, dependencies, and hidden costs that are paid over generations. Rome paid those costs every time a shipment was delayed, every time a province rebelled, every time the wind failed to fill the sails of the grain fleet. The empire, built on conquest, became dependent on the very people it had conquered. Egypt fed Rome, North Africa fed Rome, Sicily fed Rome, and Rome, in turn, gave its citizens bread and hoping that would be enough. For centuries, it was. But the dependence never disappeared. It only deepened. When the grain shipments from Africa were disrupted by the Vandal conquest of Carthage in the 5th century, Rome's population plummeted. The city that had once housed 1 million people shrank to a fraction of that size. Not because of war, but because the food stopped coming. The empire had created a population that could not feed itself, and when the empire could no longer feed them, they simply left or died. This is the final lesson of the Annona. Dependency is a bargain that only works as long as the supplier delivers. When the supplier fails, the dependent population has no alternatives, no reserves, no way to survive on its own. Rome built an empire on the backs of its legions, but it ruled its capital with bread. And in the end, when the bread stopped coming, the capital became a ghost of what it had been. The lesson for our own time is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Modern nations are building similar dependencies, not just on food, but on energy, on supply chains, on complex systems that no single person understands. When those systems fail, when the ships stop arriving, when the grain does not come, the same dynamics will unfold. People will riot. Governments will fall. Cities will empty, and the systems that seemed so permanent will reveal their fragility. Rome's grain dole lasted for centuries. It seemed as permanent as the empire itself, but nothing built on dependency lasts forever. Not empires, not cities, not systems that trade freedom for food. Rome didn't just conquer lands with legions. It ruled its capital with bread, and that bread, given freely, cost more than any emperor ever admitted. If you want to understand the systems that feed you, that control you, that make your world possible and fragile at the same time, then hit subscribe. Because the ships are still sailing. The grain is still flowing, and the dependence is still growing.